in front of hundreds of guests, in a room I had built with my own hands. My daughter-in-law pointed straight at my face and said it loud enough for every single person in that room to hear, "Get out. You are not welcome here." I didn't argue. I didn't say a word. I simply turned to look at my son, but he had already turned away. That moment told me everything I needed to know. I walked outside and made 12 phone calls. What happened next made them regret every single thing they had done and come back begging. Hello everyone, welcome to our story. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Quick note, this is a fictional story with dramatized elements added for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to real names or places is purely coincidental, but the message it carries is meaningful and worth your time. Like, subscribe, and let's begin. The music stopped the way a heart does without warning, without mercy. One moment the string quartet was playing something soft and expensive near the garden arch, and the next, silence dropped over Whitfield Estate like a curtain. Hundreds of heads turned. I felt it before I understood it, that particular stillness a room gets when something is about to go wrong, and everyone already knows it except the man standing in the middle of the floor. That man was me. Brittany walked toward me from across the reception hall, her white gown catching the chandelier light with every step. She moved like someone who had rehearsed this chin-level shoulders, back the kind of composure that doesn't come from confidence alone. It comes from planning. She stopped close enough that I could see the small diamonds in her earrings, close enough that I could have reached out and straightened her veil if I'd wanted to. I didn't want to. "You're not welcome here, Alexander." Her voice was low, but in that silence it carried to every corner of the room. "You never were." I did not respond right away. That's something people don't tell you about moments like this, how time moves differently inside them. A second stretches. You notice things you have no business noticing. The grain of the oak floor beneath my shoes, the way the candlelight caught the edge of a wine glass 3 tables over, the faint smell of the magnolia arrangements Margaret had helped Preston pick out back when she still had the strength to stand in the flower shop on Broughton Street. I turned to my left. Preston stood 3 steps away. 3 steps. The same distance I used to cross in one stride to pick him up off his bicycle when he skinned his knee on the driveway. He was 34 years old now, wearing a suit I had paid for, standing on a floor I had sanded by hand, and he would not look at me. I watched him for what felt like a very long time. His jaw was tight. His eyes were fixed somewhere on the floor between us, on the oak planks I had stripped and refinished myself during 14 months of restoration work on this estate. He knew every inch of this floor. He had watched me work it. He said nothing. 1 second, 2 seconds. The room held its breath. I straightened my jacket, nodded once at no one in particular, and walked toward the door. The guests parted as I moved through them. Not dramatically, just quietly stepping aside the way people do when they don't want to be associated with a scene they're already part of. Hundreds of eyes followed without meeting mine. Some looked away, some watched from the corners of their eyes. I recognized faces among the crowd, neighbors, business contacts, a couple who had attended Margaret's memorial service 2 years prior. I kept my pace even. A man does not hurry when he is leaving, with what remains of his dignity. At the entrance just before the heavy iron door, there is a small bronze plaque mounted on the stone column. I had forgotten it was there until that night. I stopped and read it the way you read something you already know by heart. Restored by Hargrove Construction and Restoration, LLC 2019. 6 years ago, this place had been a wreck-cracked, plaster-rotting window frames, a grand staircase that groaned under a man's weight. The owners had nearly given up on it. I had spent 11 months here with a crew of 12, and then 3 months finishing details alone, the way I always preferred. Margaret used to bring me dinner in a brown paper bag on the nights I stayed late. She drove out here even during her last round of treatment, when she was too tired to do much more than sit in the passenger seat and hand me a thermos of coffee through the window. I stood at that plaque for perhaps 10 seconds. Then I pushed through the door and walked to my truck. The night air was warm and thick with jasmine, the way Savannah always is in May. I climbed in, closed the door, and sat in the dark. I noticed my hands on the steering wheel. They were not shaking. I found that strange that after everything that had just happened inside that hall, my hands were completely still. I reached into the breast pocket of my vest and took out the check, $78,500, written in my handwriting, signed with my name, made out to Whitfield Estate Venue Services, for the final payment balance on my son's wedding. I had carried it in my jacket all evening, planning to find Nadine Buckley after the rehearsal, dinner toasts, and settle the account face-to-face the way I handle every business transaction. A handshake, a signature, done. I set it on the dashboard and looked at it for a while. The numbers didn't seem real from the outside, but I knew exactly what they represented. Early mornings, late bids, contracts negotiated at kitchen tables, jobs taken in January, cold and August heat. 31 years of Hargrove construction, built from a second-hand truck, and a promise I made to Margaret the week we got married that I would never let our family want for anything. The lights of Whitfield Estate glowed warm and golden through my windshield. Inside, I imagined the music had resumed. The wine was still cold. The guests had returned to their conversations, quietly relieved that the uncomfortable part of the evening was finished. 15 minutes passed. I didn't check the time, I know, because I counted them. Then I reached for my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name Nadine Buckley. She was the venue coordinator, the woman who had walked me through every detail of this event over the past 8 months. She was professional, precise, and as far as I knew, completely uninvolved in whatever had just taken place inside her building. My thumb rested on her name. There was a version of this night where I put the phone back in my pocket, drove home, poured 2 fingers of bourbon, and decided to let it go, to write it off as a bad evening and move forward. I had spent 63 years being a reasonable man. I had buried my wife, built my company from nothing, and raised a son I believed I knew. But that check was still sitting on my dashboard, and Nadine Buckley's name was still on my screen. I pressed call. Nadine Buckley speaking. Her voice was exactly what I had come to expect from her. Over 8 months of planning, Warm composed the kind of professional steadiness that made people feel like everything was under control. Under different circumstances, I would have appreciated it. Nadine, this is Alexander Hargrove. I kept my voice level, the way I do when I'm closing out a job site at the end of a difficult week. I need to cancel the Hargrove-Sinclair wedding, effective immediately. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Not the silence of shock, more like the silence of a person choosing their next words with care. Mr. Hargrove. A small pause. Are you certain? I am. She didn't push further. That was one thing I respected about Nadine. She understood the difference between a man who needed to be talked out of a decision and a man who had already made one. She moved into the logistics the way a good contractor moves into a job, steady, methodical, no wasted motion. I want to be transparent with you about the financial terms, she said. The $14,000 deposit paid at contract signing is non-refundable. That's standard in our agreement. I want to make sure you have that clearly in front of you before we proceed. I read the contract before I signed it, Nadine. Every clause. 31 years in the construction business teaches a man to read what he puts his name on. I had gone through that venue contract on a Sunday afternoon at my kitchen table, the same way I review every subcontractor agreement before a project begins. I had known exactly what I was agreeing to. Then you understand the position, she said. I do. Go ahead and process the cancellation. Another brief pause, the sound of keys on a keyboard, the faint rustle of paperwork. Then, I'll send written confirmation to your email within the hour. I'm sorry it ended this way, Mr. Hargrove. I truly am. I thanked her and ended the call. 11 more to make. I had the vendor list in the Notes app on my phone, every contact, every contract number, organized the way I keep all my project files. The florist was first. I had met the woman twice, once at the initial consultation, and once for a follow-up, when Margaret's roses were substituted with peonies because of a supply issue. She answered on the second ring, and I told her the same thing I had told Nadine Alexander Hargrove, canceling the Hargrove-Sinclair account, effective immediately. She was kind about it. Most of them were. The catering company was less so. Their event manager walked me through 3 separate penalty clauses before I got a word in a 48-hour cancellation fee on top of the non-refundable deposit. Additional charges for pre-ordered specialty items already prepared for tomorrow's reception. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "I understand the terms. Please send the final invoice to the address on file." He seemed surprised I didn't argue. I wasn't going to argue. These were contracts I had signed. The penalties existed because I had agreed they would. A man who spends his career holding other people to their word doesn't get to walk away from his own signature when the situation becomes inconvenient. Call after call, the picture assembled itself with the cold clarity of a final accounting ledger. The florist deposit gone, no additional penalty. The caterer deposit plus a cancellation surcharge. The photographer non-refundable retainer holding fee for the second shooter. The lighting company deposit forfeited partial equipment staging fee. The cake designer full deposit retained ingredients already sourced. The transportation service 50% of contract value already committed. By the 8th call, I had stopped tracking the individual amounts and started thinking in totals. Somewhere between the linen rental company and the rehearsal dinner coordinator, the number settled into place like a stone dropping to the bottom of still water. $38,000. Gone, not stolen, not wasted through carelessness, paid out in deposits and penalties, according to agreements I had entered into, willingly in good faith on behalf of a wedding I had believed in. The remaining balance I would not owe $40,500 sat on the other side of that number, like the answer to a math problem I hadn't wanted to solve. Between the 9th and 10th calls, I sat in silence for a moment. The parking lot of Whitfield Estate was mostly empty now. A few catering staff moved between the side entrance and a service van, carrying trays back out the evening, winding down inside. The world continuing its ordinary business on the other side of those walls. I thought about something Margaret used to say. She had a habit of distilling things down to a single sentence when I was overthinking a problem, and she was almost always right. Alex, a man who knows how to build things, has to understand the cost of tearing them down. Make sure it's worth it. She said it the first time, when I walked away from a lucrative contract in 2003 because the client had lied to me about the site conditions. I lost 40 days of work. She had stood in our kitchen doorway with a dish towel over her shoulder and said those words like they were the most obvious thing in the world. I had been annoyed at the time. Sitting in that parking lot, 11 calls into the worst evening of my adult life, I finally understood what she had meant. Not just intellectually the way you understand something you've read. I understood it in the place behind the sternum, where things actually land. She hadn't been talking about money. She had been talking about what a man is willing to lose in order to stay himself. The 10th call. The 11th. I worked through them the same way I had worked through the first name account cancellation confirmation. The vendors on the other end of the line heard a calm, deliberate man settling his accounts. None of them could have known that, somewhere between the words I was saying out loud and the silence between them, something was quietly, permanently shifting. The 12th call was the band. A live group out of Charleston, 6 musicians, a set list Margaret would never have approved of, booked by Brittany 8 months ago, when the planning was still something I had been invited to participate in. The man who answered identified himself as the band manager. "My name is Alexander Hargrove," I said. "The contract is in my name. Cancel it." He confirmed the non-refundable deposit, gave me a cancellation reference number, and wished me a good evening. I set the phone down on the passenger seat. Outside, the Savannah sky had gone completely dark, not the soft dark of early evening, but the deep, settled black that comes after midnight has made its decision, and the day is thoroughly finished. The jasmine I had noticed earlier was gone from the air, replaced by something cooler, something that carried the faint salt of the river 2 miles east. I started the engine. I did not look back at the lights of Whitfield Estate as I pulled out of the lot. There was nothing left for me to see there, only a building I had helped bring back to life, now filled with people celebrating something that no longer had anything to do with me. The road home was straight and quiet. I drove it without the radio on. The headlights died and the street went quiet. East Jones Street at midnight has a particular quality to it. the old live oaks spreading their arms over the pavement, the gas lamp on the corner throwing a circle of amber light that hasn't changed much since before I was born. I sat in the truck for a moment after I cut the engine, not because I needed to, but because the house was dark, and I wasn't quite ready for what dark houses feel like when you've been living in one alone for 2 years. I had renovated this place in 2017. Every room, the plaster walls, the heart pine floors, the kitchen Margaret had drawn out on a legal pad one Saturday morning with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. She had known by then that her treatment options were narrowing, though neither of us said it out loud. She had channeled whatever energy she had left into planning a kitchen she would actually be able to use, and I had built it exactly the way she drew it. She spent 18 months cooking in that kitchen before she lost the strength to stand at the stove. I got out of the truck, walked up the front steps, and let myself in. The study was the first room I turned on the light in. It always is. It's the room that makes the most sense to me. Walls lined with job files, framed photographs, certifications going back to the early 90s when Hargrove Construction was 3 men and a borrowed flatbed. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon from the bottle on the credenza, set the glass on the desk, and sat down without drinking it. The room looked back at me the way it always does. 31 years on those walls. The Whitfield Estate restoration. A framed photograph from the day we finished the grand staircase my crew lined up across the front steps, everyone grinning. The Coastal Resort Project in Hilton Head, 2014. The Historic District Streetscape renovation the city commissioned in 2018. Plaques from the associated builders and contractors, a letter of commendation from the Savannah Historic Preservation Board, signed by people who have since retired or passed on. And in the corner on the bottom shelf of the built-in bookcase, a framed photograph I hadn't moved in 2 years. Preston at maybe 9 or 10 years old, sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor of a job site, wearing a hard hat, 3 sizes too big for his head. He had insisted on coming to work with me one Saturday, and I had let him. He spent 4 hours asking questions about rebar and load-bearing walls and why concrete had to cure before you could build on top of it. He had a small notebook, and he wrote things down. I looked at that photograph for a long time. The boy in it had grown into the man who stood 3 steps away from me tonight and said nothing. I had watched that happen, not in a single moment, not in any one choice I could point to, but gradually the way a foundation shifts. You don't notice it until you see the crack in the wall. My phone had been buzzing on and off since I left the parking lot. I knew without looking who it was. I picked it up once, saw the screen, Preston's name, then Gloria's, then a number I didn't recognize, and turned the display face down on the desk. Whatever needed to be said between us could wait until I was ready to hear it. I was not ready tonight. I opened the laptop instead. The wedding expense file was still up from the last time I had reviewed it 3 weeks ago, when I was finalizing the check amount for Nadine. I scrolled through it now, not looking for anything new, just reading the numbers in the way a man reads a document after the decision has already been made, and what remains is only the accounting. Venue rental and coordination, $14,000 paid in full at deposit. Catering and bar service, $19,500. Deposit paid, balance pending. Floral arrangements, $11,000. Deposit paid. Photography and videography, $8,500. Retainer paid. Live music, $7,000. Deposit paid. Specialty wedding gown and alterations, $6,800. Paid in full at Brittany's request 2 months prior. Total committed $78,500. Of that $38,000 was already gone. Deposits and cancellation penalties settled by phone in a parking lot in less than 2 hours. The rest, I would not have to pay. I had known the arithmetic before I made the first call. I had made peace with it somewhere between the caterer and the photographer. What I had not made peace with what I sat with now in the quiet of my study was the reason behind every line item. Each deposit, each signed contract, each check I had written without hesitation had come from the same place. Margaret was not there to see her son get married. The least I could do was make sure it was something worth remembering. That was what I had told myself. That was why I had written the checks. I closed the laptop. The bottom drawer of my desk was slightly open. I must have left it that way earlier in the week. I reached to push it shut, and my hand stopped. In the back corner of the drawer, half covered by a folded survey map from the Whitfield project, sat a wooden box. Small, rectangular, the kind a craftsman makes by hand with dovetailed joints and a fitted lid. The wood had gone dull with time. I had made it myself years ago, from offcuts of heart pine left over from a flooring job. Margaret had used it to keep things she considered important and private things she did not want mixed in with the ordinary papers of daily life. I had not opened it since the day of her funeral. I did not open it now. I looked at it for perhaps 30 seconds, then reached past it and pushed the drawer closed with the flat of my hand. Not tonight. The bourbon glass was still full on the corner of the desk. I left it there. I turned off the desk lamp and stood for a moment in the dark, letting my eyes adjust. The amber glow from the gas lamp on the corner came through the front window in a long, thin rectangle across the heart pine floor, the same floor Margaret had walked across in her slippers every morning for 8 years. I went upstairs. I did not sleep, but I lay down, and that was close enough. Sleep, it turns out, is not something a man can negotiate with. By 3 a.m, I had given up pretending otherwise. I came back downstairs in the dark, settled into the chair behind my desk, and opened the laptop. The screen lit up the room in a pale, flat white, the only light in the house, the only thing moving. The bourbon glass was still where I had left it untouched, the ice long since melted into the whiskey. I did not reach for it. There are things a man thinks about at 3 a.m. that he can keep at arm's length during the day. The daylight hours have appointments, phone calls, decisions, enough forward motion to keep the past from catching up. But at 3 a.m, with the street outside gone completely still, and nothing on the screen in front of me except my own reflection. The past does whatever it wants. I thought about 1995. He was 32 years old. I had a used Ford F2 5.0 with a cracked dashboard, $4,000 in a checking account, a contractor's license I had studied for over 2 winters, and a wife who told me without hesitation, without conditions, that she believed I could do it. I had no crew, no office, no company name yet. I had one residential remodel job lined up in Ardsley Park, a kitchen and bathroom for a retired couple who had known Margaret's parents. They paid me $11,000. I finished 2 weeks ahead of schedule. I named the company Hargrove Construction the week that job was done. Margaret said it sounded solid. She was right about most things. For 15 years, I ran it lean and careful, took the jobs I could deliver, turned down the ones I couldn't pay my crew on time, even in the quarters when that meant I took less myself. By 2010, we had grown enough that I needed a full-time office manager. I posted the position on a Friday. By Monday, I had 9 applications. Cornelius Hatch was the 3rd interview. He was 29 years old with a background in commercial property management and a way of listening to a question before answering it that I had rarely seen in someone that age. Most people in interviews are already forming their next sentence while you're still finishing yours. Cornelius sat across from me at the kitchen table. I didn't have a proper office then. We worked out of the house, and he waited until I was completely done before he spoke. I offered him the job at the end of that same meeting. 15 years later, he still worked that way. Deliberate, precise, never used a word he didn't mean, which was why I had read his email 3 times. He had sent it at 11:17 in the evening, late for Cornelius, who kept regular hours with the discipline of a man who respected other people's time. The message was short, the way his messages always were. When you have a moment this weekend, there are some documents I'd like you to look over. Nothing too urgent. But that was where it ended. I had assumed at first that it was a send error, that the rest of the sentence had been cut off somehow. But Cornelius did not make send errors. He proofread everything twice. If the message ended with, but it was because he had chosen to end it there, because whatever came after, but was something he did not want to put in writing. In 15 years, I had never known him to be cautious about putting something in writing. He was the man who documented everything, who kept backup copies of backup copies, who had once emailed me a 3-paragraph summary of a 10-minute phone call, just to make sure we had a record. I sat with that for a while. The rest of my mind and the way the mind works at that hour drifted back to Brittany. I tried to remember the first time something had felt wrong. Not wrong in a way I could name, just a small, persistent friction, like a door that hangs a quarter-inch off plumb. You can live with it. You can forget it's there for weeks at a time. But it's always slightly wrong, and somewhere in the back of your mind, you know it. She had come into Preston's life 18 months before the engagement. He had brought her to Sunday dinner at this house in November, a cold night, the kind Savannah gets maybe a dozen times a year. She had been charming in the way that people are charming when they are working at it. The compliments were well placed. She had asked about the house renovation, about the company, about the Whitfield estate project I had just completed. She said the words, "everything you've built," twice in one evening, which I noticed at the time and filed away without examining too closely. She asked the right questions. She smiled at the right moments. She made Preston look at her the way a man looks at someone he's trying to impress, which should have been the other way around. I had told myself I was being uncharitable. Margaret always said I took too long to trust people, that I approached human beings the way I approached new construction sites, looking for structural problems before I'd even walked the foundation. She wasn't wrong. I had learned to extend more benefit of the doubt than my instincts preferred. So, I had extended it. I had written the checks and signed the contracts and handed over the deposits and told myself that what I was feeling was nothing more than a father's natural adjustment to no longer being the primary man in his son's life. Maybe I had been wrong to extend it that far. Outside, the sky had been making up its mind for the better part of an hour. By the time I noticed it, the darkness had shifted from black to something softer, a deep gray at the edges of the window frame. Then slowly, a line of pale rose along the top of the roofline across the street. Savannah mornings come in gently, even the difficult ones. The light does not announce itself. It simply arrives. I closed the laptop. The study returned to shadow. I sat still for a moment, listening to the house settle around me, the small creaks and sighs that old buildings make when the temperature changes. Sounds I had learned to read, the way I read a structure's response to load. Then the knock came. 3 hard impacts against the front door, not a question, not a polite request. The knock of someone who expected to be let in. I knew the rhythm of it before I heard the voice. "Dad, open up. We need to talk." I saw him through the side window before I opened the door. Preston stood on the porch with his shoulder against one of the columns, one hand raised like he was about to knock again. He was still wearing the suit from the night before, jacket rumple collar, open the bow tie, gone somewhere between Whitfield Estate and here. His hair was uncombed. He looked like a man who had not slept, which meant we had that much in common. I had built this porch for Margaret in the spring of 2017, wide enough for 2 rocking chairs and a small table. With a ceiling fan she had picked out herself from a catalog she kept on her nightstand. She had wanted somewhere to sit and listen to the rain come in off the river. Savannah gets a particular kind of afternoon rain in the summer, warm and heavy, and she had loved it in the way people love things they know they won't always have. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. He didn't wait for an invitation. He came through the doorway the way a man comes through when he's been rehearsing the conversation in the car on the way over, already moving, already talking. "You destroyed everything." His voice filled the front hallway. "Do you understand what you did last night? Do you have any idea?" I stepped back, let him come in, and said nothing. He moved into the study, the same room I had been sitting in all night, and turned to face me. The vendors had been calling since before dawn, he said. Brittany was devastated. Guests had flown in from out of state, booked hotels, rearranged their schedules. His voice rose and fell the way it does when a person has convinced themselves of something and needs the words to do the convincing all over again. I let him finish. It took a while. I stood near the doorway with my arms at my sides and listened to all of it. The accusations arranged in the order he had decided, they were most effective, each one layered on top of the last. I had acted without thinking. I had embarrassed him in front of everyone he knew. I had no right to make a unilateral decision about a wedding he was paying for, though we both knew who had been writing the checks. When he ran out of momentum, I asked him one question. "Did you say a single word to stop her last night? Preston, one word?" The room went quiet. He looked at me the way people look when they've been asked something they prepared an answer for, and the answer they prepared doesn't fit the question they actually received. His jaw moved slightly. He looked at the wall, then back at me. He said nothing. I nodded once and waited, giving him space to find whatever he wanted to say next. What he found after a moment was a different direction entirely. I was controlling, he said. I had never truly accepted Brittany. I had always found reasons to keep her at a distance to make her feel unwelcome in our family. I treated every relationship in my life like a construction project. My terms, my timeline, my specifications. He had spent his whole life watching me manage people instead of loving them. I sat down in the chair by the window and let him say all of it. There was some truth in the edges of what he was describing. I knew that about myself. Margaret had said similar things over the years, though, with more precision and considerably more kindness. A man who builds things for a living does develop habits of mind that don't always serve him well at the kitchen table. I had been working on that for 30 years with mixed results. But then he said something else. Mom always said you had a way of pushing people away. His voice had gone quieter, which somehow made it land harder. It sounds like she was right to worry about you. I looked at him for a long moment. Margaret had said many things to me over 38 years of marriage. Things that challenged me, corrected me, things that were difficult to hear and necessary to hear. She had been honest with me in the particular way that people are honest when they love someone enough to risk the discomfort of it. I knew her voice in every register. I knew the shape of her concerns. She had never said that to me, not in those words, not in any words that meant the same thing. I didn't say so. There are arguments worth having, and arguments that aren't, and I have spent enough years on job sites to know the difference between a load-bearing wall and a partition. What Preston had just said was not a load-bearing wall. It was something he had constructed in the last 12 hours because he needed something to hold on to, and I was the nearest fixed point. I stood up. I crossed the room to the front door, the same door I had opened 10 minutes ago, and I pulled it open. The morning air came in cool still, the way Savannah mornings are before the heat settles in. A mockingbird was going through its repertoire somewhere in the magnolia 2 houses down. Leave Preston. My voice was level, not raised, not hard, just clear the way a measurement is clear. Come back when you're ready to have an honest conversation. He stared at me for a moment. Then something in his posture changed the rehearsed anger, deflating into something that looked more like exhaustion, or maybe something younger than that. He walked past me without another word down the porch steps and along the front path. I closed the door. I put my back against the old wood and stood there in the front hall in the quiet that follows when someone leaves and takes all their noise with them. The house absorbed it the way old houses absorb everything steadily, without comment. My phone buzzed in my shirt pocket. I took it out and looked at the screen. Gloria Hargrove. Alex Honey. Gloria's voice came through the way it always does when she wants something warm at the surface with just enough sweetness underneath to let you know the ask is coming. She is 58 years old, and she has been using that particular tone since she was about 9 when she figured out it worked on our father. It still works on most people. It has never worked on me, which is something she has never entirely forgiven. Preston just called me, she said. That boy is a wreck. You need to fix this before it gets any worse. I was standing in the kitchen by then, the phone against my ear, watching the coffee finish brewing. I had not eaten since the evening before. The morning light was coming through the window over the sink, the same window Margaret had stood at for 8 years. The one that looks out over the back garden, where she grew tomatoes and sweet williams every summer without fail. Good morning, Gloria, I said. Alex, I'm serious. There's still time. The wedding is tomorrow. The guests are already here. People flew in from Atlanta, from Charlotte, from up north. If you just reach out to Brittany, make some kind of gesture, I'm not going to do that. Why are you being so stubborn about this? This is your son's wedding. It was, I said, until last night. She went quiet for a moment. I poured the coffee, set the pot back on the burner, and waited. Gloria processes things the way she always has, by reorganizing her approach when the first one doesn't land. You can't honestly tell me what Brittany said was worth all of this. She was nervous. It was the rehearsal dinner. People say things. She said I was never welcome there, in front of everyone who came to celebrate a wedding I paid for. I kept my voice even. Preston was standing 3 feet away and said nothing. That is what happened, Gloria. I need you to understand it clearly before we continue this conversation. Another silence, shorter this time. I know, she said, and something shifted slightly in her voice, not capitulation, but a small retreat from the position she had called to defend. I know it wasn't right. I'm just saying, what are you just saying? She sighed. I'm saying that Brittany is going to be part of this family. Whatever your feelings about last night, that is still the situation. And you making a statement, even a justified one, doesn't change that. I drank my coffee and let the silence sit between us. There was no version of this conversation that was going to resolve anything this morning, and I think we both knew it. Gloria had called because Preston had asked her to, and she was doing what she does, managing, mediating, smoothing over the places where the structure shows its cracks. She had been doing it her whole life. It was not entirely without value, but then she said something she had not meant to say. It's just... She paused in the way people pause when they're about to tell you something they've been sitting on. Brittany mentioned a few weeks ago that she wanted to be more involved in the business side of things. I just assumed she meant it the way a daughter-in-law means it, wanting to help out, wanting to feel included. I didn't think much of it at the time. I set my coffee cup down on the counter. What exactly did she say? I asked. Just that she thought there were ways she could contribute, that she had some ideas about the direction of the company. Gloria's voice had gone a little uncertain, like she was only now hearing the words she had filed away 3 weeks ago. I told her that was between her and you. I didn't pursue it. Thank you, Gloria, I said. I'll talk to you soon. I ended the call before she could regroup. Clifton Sinclair called 4 minutes later. I knew who he was, Brittany's father, a man I had met 3 times over 18 months. He ran a real estate office in Charleston, and had the particular manner of someone who was accustomed to being the most important person in the room. We had never had what I would call a genuine conversation. We had exchanged pleasantries at the engagement dinner, talked briefly about property values in the low country, and shaken hands at the end of each meeting with equal relief that it was over. He spoke for 2 minutes about the reputation of both families, the embarrassment to his daughter, the investment of time and planning, and something about mutual respect. His voice had the quality of a man reading from a script he had written in his head on the drive over. I let him finish his 2nd minute. Then I ended the call. The text from Brittany started shortly after. They came in a sequence 3, then a pause, then 2 more. I read them in order, standing at the kitchen counter with my coffee going cold beside me. The first few were what I expected, the kind of language people use when they're angry and want you to feel it, controlling, jealous, unable to accept that Preston had built his own life. I read those without much reaction. Then the last one came through. You were never worthy of what we had planned for you anyway. I read it once. Then I read it again. Not for the wedding, not for Preston, not for our family, for you. There is a particular quality to language when it slips, when a person is angry enough that the careful architecture of what they meant to say gives way to what they actually meant. I had seen it in contract disputes and project disagreements, in the rare occasions when a client revealed, usually by accident, what they had actually been after all along, what we had planned for you. The word we sat in that sentence like a nail in a board. I put the phone face down on the counter and stood still for a moment. Then I picked it up again and scrolled to Cornelius. He answered on the 2nd ring, the way he always does, no preamble, just present. Cornelius. I kept my voice the way I keep it when I am giving instructions on a job site, clear, direct, no room for interpretation. I need you to pull every document, every contract, every email connected to company accounts for the past 8 months. All of it. Don't discuss this with anyone. A short pause. Not hesitation, consideration. The way Cornelius processes before he responds. Yes, sir, he said. I'll start tonight. The afternoon came in quietly. By the time I noticed it, the light in the study had shifted from the flat white of midday to something warmer, the particular amber that Savannah gets in the late hours before evening, when the sun drops low enough to come through the Spanish moss and turn everything the color of old honey. It came through the linen curtains in long, slow rectangles across the floor. The house had been silent since Preston left. I had spent the middle hours of the day doing the things a man does when he needs to keep his hands occupied, reviewed a set of project specs for a commercial renovation job scheduled to start the following month, responded to 2 contractor inquiries, updated the payroll file Cornelius would need on Monday. Small tasks, the kind that don't ask anything of you except your attention. By mid-afternoon, I had run out of them. I sat down at the desk. The drawer was closed. I looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you have been aware of for a long time without acknowledging directly. Then I opened it and took out the wooden box. It was lighter than I remembered, or maybe I had remembered it as heavier because of what it held. I had made it myself years ago from offcuts of heart pine left over from a flooring job in the Ardsley Park neighborhood. Dovetail joints a fitted lid, a small brass clasp that Margaret had chosen from a hardware catalog. She had a careful, considered way of choosing things. She never picked the first option. The clasp was still bright. Everything else had gone soft with time. I set it on the desk and sat with it for a moment before I opened it. Inside, the envelopes were arranged the way she would have arranged them, not stacked carelessly, but placed in a deliberate order, each one, flat each one, sealed. She had used the good stationery, the cream-colored paper she kept in the top drawer of her writing desk, upstairs, the kind she saved for things that mattered. The handwriting on each envelope was hers, though in the way her handwriting had become, toward the end, a little slower, a little less certain in the pressure, but still unmistakably Margaret. There were 4 envelopes in total, 1 for Preston, 1 for Gloria, 1 for a woman named Dorothy, who had been Margaret's closest friend since college, and who still sends me a card every year on the anniversary of the day we lost her, and 1 with my name on it, Alex, just that, in her hand. I did not open mine first. I picked up Preston's envelope and held it for a moment. I had no intention of reading his letter. It was his, and whatever she had written inside, it belonged to him, and no one else. But I turned it over, once ran my thumb along the sealed edge, and thought about what she had known at the time she wrote it. She had written these letters in the last months, when she still had the clarity to say what she needed to say, and the stubbornness to make sure she said it. I had sat with her on many of those afternoons, sometimes talking, sometimes just present in the same room, reading in the chair by the window while she wrote at her desk. I had not asked what she was writing. It had seemed important to give her that space. She had sealed each envelope herself and put them in the box and told me where to find it. When the time comes, she had said, "You'll know when." I placed Preston's envelope back and picked up my own. The paper inside was 2 pages front and back of a single folded sheet filled in her careful hand. I had to read the first paragraph twice because my eyes kept moving ahead before the words had finished settling. She wrote the way she talked, directly without decoration, with a precision that she had spent a lifetime refining. She did not waste words on preamble. She began as she always had by saying exactly what she meant. "Alex, I know you. You will give until there is nothing left, and then you will blame yourself for running empty. I am asking you one last time to stop." I set the page down, picked it up again. "The day you begin living for yourself, instead of building for everyone else, that is the day I can finally close my eyes in peace. You have given enough. Now it is time to receive." I had read a great deal in my 63 years. I had read contracts and blueprints and engineering reports and 200 pages of estate law in the weeks after she passed. I had read her grocery lists and her garden notes and the birthday cards she gave me every year without fail, always handwritten, always specific to something that had happened that year. I had never read anything that took me apart the way those 2 pages did. It was not anger. It was not the particular grief that ambushes you at odd moments, the kind that shows up when you smell coffee brewing or hear a song she liked on the radio. This was something older and quieter than that. The feeling of being known completely by someone who is no longer there to know you. The strange compound ache of being loved across a distance that nothing closes. She had written these words knowing she would not be here when I read them. She had trusted that I would find my way to the box eventually, that whatever came, I would sit down in this room, in this chair, and open it. She had been right. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the light to shift again, the amber deepening toward the early blue of dusk, the rectangles on the floor going soft at the edges, and then dissolving entirely. When I finally folded the letter and placed it gently back in the envelope, my hands were not entirely steady. I did not mind. I set the envelope in the box, placed the lid back on, and held the clasp closed for a moment without fastening it. Then my phone moved on the desk beside me. A single vibration. A text message. I picked it up. Cornelius's name at the top. No words in the message body, just a PDF attachment, its icon sitting there on the screen, like something waiting to be acknowledged. I looked at it for a long moment. The sky outside the study window had gone the deep, uncertain blue that comes just before full dark, that brief window when the day hasn't entirely surrendered, but the night has already decided. The magnolia across the street was a dark shape against a darker sky. My thumb rested on the file icon. I did not open it. Not yet. If that letter hit you the way it hit me, type "open" in the comments, so I know you're still with me. Quick reminder, this story contains fictional elements added for dramatic and reflective purposes. If that's not your preference, no hard feelings, but if you're staying what comes next, we'll change everything. I opened the file just before dark. The PDF loaded in 3 pages. The first was a screenshot of an email thread, the kind of screenshot taken deliberately with the full header information, visible sender, recipient date, subject line. Cornelius had known exactly what he was sending me. I read the first line. The sender address was preston.hargrove@hargroveconstruction.com. I had created that account myself 14 months ago. On a Tuesday afternoon when Preston had come by the office and we had talked for the first time in a long time about what the future of the company might look like. It had been a good conversation, one of those rare ones where I felt like I was talking to my son rather than managing him. I had set up the email address that same evening as a small concrete gesture towards something I had not yet allowed myself to name directly. A possibility. A continuation. The recipient was a firm called Mercer and Associates listed at an address in Columbia, South Carolina. The subject line read, Inquiry Spousal Rights and LLC Ownership Transfer Procedures, Georgia Construction. I read it again. Then I read the body of the email. It was written carefully, not in Preston's natural voice, which I know the way. I know my own handwriting, but in the flattened, deliberate language of someone who had been coached on what to ask and how to ask it. The inquiry was specific. What were the legal mechanisms by which a spouse could establish partial ownership of a family-held LLC in Georgia? What documentation would be required? What was the typical timeline for such a transfer? The date stamp at the top of the thread read July 15th. I had agreed to fund the wedding on July 12th. I sat with that for a moment. 3 days. The deposit conversation, the handshake, the check. I wrote without hesitation, and 3 days later, this email sent from an account I had created as an act of trust, directed to a law firm 2 states over, asking how to take apart what I had spent 30 years building. I closed the laptop, put on my jacket, and drove to the office. Cornelius was already there when I arrived. The lights were on in the back room, where we keep the project archives filing cabinets going back to 1998, organized by year and job number. The institutional memory of everything Hargrove Construction had ever built or contracted. He had pulled 3 folders and laid them open on the long work table. These came through the shared company inbox, he said. I managed that account. I flagged them when I noticed the send pattern they went out and came back on days when you were on site in Hilton Head. He stepped back to let me look. 3 vendor invoices. The florist, the catering company, the lighting contractor. Each one had a confirmation signature on the bottom, the kind of sign-off required to authorize a payment advance, the kind that carries the weight of a contractual commitment. The name on each signature line read, Alexander Hargrove. I bent over the table and looked at the first one for a long time. In 31 years of running a construction company, I have signed my name on thousands of documents, subcontractor agreements, material purchase orders, city permit applications, insurance certifications, loan paperwork, change orders at 6 a.m. on job sites when the light wasn't good and my hands were cold. I know my signature the way a musician knows a chord, not by thinking about it, but by feel. The proportion of the letters, the particular way the H leads into the A, the slight leftward lean I've had since I was 19 years old. And a drafting instructor told me to correct it, and I never did. The signature on those invoices was not mine. It was close enough that someone unfamiliar with my hand might not have noticed. The general shape was there, but the pressure was wrong. The H was too upright, and the final E of Hargrove trailed off in a direction mine never goes. That's not my signature, Cornelius. I straightened up. It doesn't even come close. He nodded once. I know, sir. That's why I pulled everything. He had also printed the email thread for exchanges between the company account and Mercer and Associates over a period of 6 weeks. The replies from the law firm were cautious, as law firm replies tend to be, but they answered the questions. They outlined the general framework for spousal interest claims in Georgia LLCs. They referenced specific statutes. They mentioned the importance of establishing a documented pattern of business participation. That phrase stopped me. A documented pattern of business participation. I thought about Brittany asking Gloria about the business. I thought about the 2 times she had come to the office unannounced, once in September, once in October, with coffee and questions about how project billing worked. I had thought at the time that she was making an effort, being interested, doing the things a person does when they want to be welcomed into a family. I set the papers down on the table. The office around me was familiar in the way that a place becomes familiar after 3 decades, the smell of old paper and machine oil, and the particular dust that settles in buildings that do. Real work. The photographs on the wall were the same photographs I had in the study at home, the same jobs, the same crew, the same years. Everything I was looking at, I had built. Everything on those invoices someone else had signed for. I walked to the window. Outside, Savannah had settled into its Saturday night, the streetlights on a few cars moving slowly on the road below, the ordinary machinery of a city that did not know or care what was happening in this office on this particular evening. Call Theodore Garland, I said. I kept my voice the way I keep it when a job site has gone wrong, and there is work to be done and no margin for anything except clarity. Tell him I need to meet first thing Sunday morning. Tell him to bring everything he knows about forgery law in the state of Georgia. Cornelius already had his phone in his hand. Yes, sir, he said. Theodore Garland opened his office door at 8:02. He was in a plain Oxford shirt and khakis, no tie, no jacket, the closest thing to casual that Theo ever gets on a day he considers working. He had 2 cups of coffee from the place on the corner, the one that has been there since before either of us could afford the neighborhood it sits in. He handed me one without a word and stepped back to let me in. 35 years of friendship looks like that. No ceremony, no questions at the door. Just 2 cups of coffee and enough space for whatever needed to be said. His office on Bull Street is the kind of room that accumulates a man's professional life without apology, floor-to-ceiling shelves on 2 walls. Case files organized in a system only he fully understands, a desk that has probably not been fully cleared since the Clinton administration. A framed photograph of the 2 of us from a fishing trip to the Georgia coast in 2009 sits on the corner of the credenza, slightly crooked. I have never mentioned it, neither has he. I sat down across from him and told him everything. He did not interrupt once. That is one of the things I have always valued about Theo. He listens the way a good attorney listens, which is completely different from the way most people listen. He is not forming his response while you are still talking. He is building a picture piece by piece, and he waits until the picture is complete before he says anything at all. When I finished, he set down his coffee and picked up the folder I had brought the 3 vendor invoices Cornelius had pulled, plus the printed email thread from the company account. He went through them in order, slowly reading each page the way he reads everything thoroughly, without skimming. After several minutes, he set the folder flat on the desk and looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. Under OCGA, Section 16-9-1, he said, "What you have here meets the threshold for first-degree forgery in Georgia. Signing another person's name on a document with the intent to defraud, that is a felony. Category 1, the sentencing range runs from 1 year to 15. I know, I said. I want to make sure you heard it clearly. He tapped the edge of the folder. This isn't a civil matter, Alex. This isn't a vendor dispute or a contract disagreement. What happened with these invoices, if it can be proven as deliberate, and this paper trail suggests it can, is a criminal act under Georgia state law. I nodded. He picked up the printed emails next the thread between Preston's company account and Mercer and Associates in Columbia. He read through it more slowly than he had read the invoices. This wasn't impulsive, he said when he looked up. She was researching LLC ownership transfer procedures before the wedding invitations went out. That is not a woman who made a mistake in a moment of poor judgment. That is a woman who was working towards something specific. He paused. The question is how far down that road she had gotten. That's what I need to know, I said. He set the emails down and folded his hands on the desk, the particular posture he adopts when he's about to lay out a plan, which I recognized from 3 decades of watching him work. 3 steps, he said, in this order. He began with the cease and desist letter, not a court order. He explained a formal legal communication, informing Brittany that we possess documented evidence of unauthorized use of company resources and signature forgery, and that any further contact with company accounts or personnel would result in immediate criminal referral. It would be delivered to her by end of business Monday. Its purpose was not to resolve the matter. It was to make clear that the matter existed and that we were prepared to pursue it. Second, a formal complaint filed with the Savannah Police Department. The forgery evidence, the 3 invoices, the email chain, the signature comparisons would go into their hands as a package. The investigation process would take time, he said. Weeks at minimum, more likely months. The machinery of a criminal inquiry does not move quickly, and I should not expect it to. But filing the complaint established the record, and the record was what mattered now. Third, Preston's name needed to come off the authorized signer list on the company's operating account. Not as punishment as a necessary precaution, given that his company email had been used in correspondence with an outside law firm inquiring about ownership transfer procedures. That was the moment I had been sitting with since the night before. His account was the one used Theo. I know. He may not have known what she was doing with it. Theo looked at me for a moment. He may not have, he said carefully, or he may have. That determination is part of what an investigation would establish. What I can tell you is that under Georgia law, if he had knowledge of the unauthorized access and did not report it, he could face accessory charges. The exposure depends entirely on what he knew and when. I sat with that. Outside the window, Bull Street was doing what it does on Sunday mornings, quiet, unhurried. The old live oaks throwing their shadows across the sidewalk in the way they have for 150 years. A couple walked past with a dog. A car moved slowly toward the intersection. The city had no idea. Do what the law requires, Theo, I said. Nothing more, nothing less. He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded once. I'll have the letter drafted by tonight. I finished my coffee, gathered my copy of the documents, and stood up. We shook hands at the door, the handshake of 2 men who have known each other long enough that the gesture means something beyond courtesy. He kept hold of it a moment longer than usual. You doing all right? He asked. I'm doing what needs to be done, I said. He accepted that answer the way he accepts most things, without pushing, without comment. He understood the difference. I stepped out onto Bull Street just before 10 o'clock. The October sun was already warm on the pavement. That particular Savannah warmth that persists well into the fall, the city holding on to summer, longer than it has any right to. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the street go about its morning. Then my phone buzzed, a bank notification, sent at 9:47 a.m. Transaction request on Hargrove Construction operating account. Amount $14,200, status pending approval. I read it twice. Preston had initiated a withdrawal from the company account. The request was sitting in the system flagged for authorization because the amount exceeded the single transaction threshold I had set 2 years ago as a matter of routine financial management. Standard procedure, nothing above $10,000 moved without a second confirmation. It had saved me $14,200 so far. I put the phone in my jacket pocket and started walking toward my truck. Removing Preston as an authorized signer on that account had been the third item on Theo's list. As of this moment, it had moved to first. I had 30 minutes of driving to make it happen before the bank's Sunday window closed. The branch manager at Savannah Bank and Trust on Broughton Street was a woman in her 40s named Patricia Professional Unhurried, the kind of person who has handled enough sensitive account matters to know that the man sitting across from her on a Sunday morning with a folder of documents and a calm expression is not someone who needs to be talked through the process. I stated my request clearly remove Preston Hargrove from the authorized signer list on the Hargrove Construction Operating Account, effective immediately. I presented my identification, the LLC operating agreement, naming me as sole managing member, and the account documentation. I did not explain my reasons beyond what the paperwork required. Patricia did not ask. The process took 20 minutes. I signed where I was asked to sign, received the confirmation paperwork, and thanked her by name on the way out. In the parking lot, I sat in the truck and checked my phone for the first time since leaving Bull Street. 11 missed calls, all from Preston. The timestamps ran from 10:08 to 10:41, the duration of my time inside the bank, give or take. I sat looking at the number for a moment, then pressed call back. He answered before the first ring had finished. The words came fast and loud, the particular velocity of someone who has been rehearsing in a parking lot of his own for the better part of an hour. I had embarrassed him. I had overstepped. I had no right to unilaterally make decisions about a shared financial relationship. He was going to retain legal counsel. He was going to make sure everyone understood what kind of man I actually was. I let him go until he ran out of forward motion. Then I said, "You attempted to withdraw $14,200 from the company operating account at 9:47 this morning, Preston. An account you have never had a legitimate business reason to access." Silence. Not the silence of someone thinking. The silence of someone who has just heard the ground shift under their feet. He started. Then I heard the phone change hands. A rustle, a muffled exchange of words I could not make out. And then a different voice, sharper, higher, stripped of the warmth it deployed selectively in better circumstances. "You are going to regret everything you've done, old man." I ended the call. I set the phone on the passenger seat and opened the laptop I had brought from the house. The email confirmation had come through while I was in the bank. I had seen the notification, but hadn't read it yet. I opened it now. The subject line read, "Villa Positano exclusive booking confirmation." The body of the email was the kind of detailed confirmation that luxury travel services send property description, arrival, logistics service inclusions. 7 nights at a private villa on the Amalfi Coast, dedicated concierge service, a private boat available daily for coastal excursions, dinner reservations at 3 separate restaurants prearranged upon request, total charged $22,000. Payment method, American Express card ending in 4471. I sat with that number for a long moment. My American Express card ending in 4471. The one I kept in my billfold, the one I used for larger purchases and travel expenses, the one I had carried in the same leather wallet for the better part of 6 years. I thought back carefully, not with agitation, but with the methodical attention I give to any problem that requires reconstruction. Brittany had a habit at restaurants of offering to help. "Let me get that. Let me take care of it," reaching for the check, reaching for the card, handing it to the server before I had finished reading the bill. I had taken it as graciousness as the gesture of a young woman, trying to demonstrate that she valued my company. It had happened at least 4 or 5 times over 18 months. Enough occasions spread across enough different evenings to read a 16-digit number and a 3-digit security code without appearing to try. I did not feel rage about this. I want to be precise about that. What I felt was something colder and more settled, the sensation of a picture coming fully into focus after a long time of standing too close to it. The deposits I had lost, the booking on my card, the withdrawal attempt that morning, laid end to end, they were not a series of separate events. They were a plan executed in stages by someone who had decided well in advance what she intended to take. I opened the notes application on my laptop and typed 3 lines. Wedding deposits and cancellation penalties $38,000. Amalfi Coast reservation, unauthorized card use $22,000. Attempted company account withdrawal blocked $14,200. Total exposure $74,200. I read the total once. Then I closed the laptop, got out of the truck, and drove home. Back at the house on East Jones Street, I put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window while the water came to temperature. The back garden was the way it always is. In October, the tomato plants Margaret had planted along the south fence long since finished for the season. The sweet williams she favored gone dormant, the whole bed waiting quietly for spring. I had not replanted it the way she had kept it. That was something I was still working my way toward. I poured the coffee, real coffee this time, from the stovetop percolator, not the drip machine, and carried it to the front room. The bourbon glass from Friday night was still on the study desk. I had walked past it a dozen times over the past 2 days without touching it. I picked it up now, carried it to the kitchen sink, and poured it out. Then I washed the glass and set it to dry. I was standing at the counter with my coffee when the knock came. Not the hard, demanding knock I had heard Saturday morning. This was the knock of someone who was not entirely sure they were welcome, and was choosing to be respectful about it anyway. 3 quiet taps, evenly spaced. I went to the front door and opened it. Odell Crutcher stood on the porch. He lived 4 houses down on East Jones Street, and had been my neighbor for 11 years. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, with the unhurried manner of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. He was holding a ceramic plate covered with a dish towel, and the smell that came through the towel was the smell of buttermilk biscuits fresh from the oven. He looked at me with the expression of a man who had heard enough through the neighborhood to understand the general shape of things without needing to be told the details. "Alex," he said, "you eaten anything today?" The biscuits were still warm. Odell had settled into the other rocking chair, the way a man settles in when he intends to stay a while, not perching on the edge, not angled toward the door, but fully back. His weight distributed the way it gets when a person has decided that wherever they are is where they need to be for the time being. The plate sat on the small table between us, 2 cups of coffee, both steaming. The Sunday afternoon quiet of East Jones Street spread out in front of us like something that had been there for a long time and intended to stay. In the distance, the bells from a church somewhere south of Forsyth Park were finishing whatever they had started. The live oaks along the street moved slightly in a wind that barely qualified as one, just enough to shift the Spanish moss and carry the faint, dry smell of old wood and autumn leaves that Savannah gets when October finally means what it says. I started talking somewhere around the first cup of coffee. I had not planned to say all of it. I had told Theodore Garland everything because he was my attorney, and that was the nature of what we were doing. I had told Cornelius the parts he needed to know, because the evidence was in his hands and the company was at stake. But sitting on my own porch with a neighbor I had known for 11 years, a man who had helped me hang a new gate in 2019, and who left bags of produce from his garden on my doorstep every August, without ever mentioning it sitting there, I found that the whole of it came out. Not to ask for guidance, not to be told what to do, just to hear it in my own voice outside the walls of the house in the open air. There is something different about saying a thing out loud to another person, rather than thinking it in a dark room at 3 a.m. It becomes more real in some ways, and more manageable in others. Odell listened the way he does everything without hurry, without filling the pauses with his own voice. He looked at the street, mostly occasionally at me, never in a way that pressed for more than I was ready to give. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "My father used to say a tree never apologizes for still standing after a storm." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. That is the particular gift of a man who chooses his words carefully. When he says something, it carries its own weight without needing to be explained. We sat without speaking for a stretch that might have been 10 minutes or 20. A car rolled past, slowly windows down, gospel music coming from the speakers in that easy Sunday way. A pair of young women walked a dog on the far sidewalk. The ordinary machinery of a neighborhood going through an ordinary afternoon, indifferent to the fact that it was anything but ordinary for the man sitting on the porch at number 47. At some point, Odell said, You remember the morning you started work out at that estate, the big one out on the highway? Whitfield, I said. He nodded. Margaret was there, standing beside you at the fence line when they were laying the first section of foundation. I drove past on the way back from my brother's place, saw the two of you out there early before the crew had really gotten going. He paused. She was using a cane that day. She was. Still wouldn't leave. I looked at the boards of the porch floor. I had laid them myself the same year I built the railings and the ceiling fan Margaret had chosen. Heart pine tight grain, sanded smooth. She had walked across these boards in her slippers every morning of the last 2 years she was here. That was the last time she stood long enough to watch me work, I said. She didn't say anything about it afterward, neither did I. Odell nodded once slowly and let the silence be what it was. A little while later, he stood up. He gathered his side of the conversation, the way he gathers everything without fuss. He picked up his empty cup, set it on the plate, and moved toward the porch steps. Then he stopped. He turned back with the expression of a man who has been deciding whether to say something for the better part of an hour and has just finished deciding. One more thing, he said. A couple of weeks back, maybe 2, maybe 3. There was a man parked across the street, twice on different days. I didn't recognize him. He nodded toward the curb where East Jones Street lay quiet in the afternoon light. Older fellow, sat in the car maybe 20 minutes each time, then drove off. Out-of-state plates I noticed because I was trimming the hedge and had a clear look. I waited. Didn't think much of it at the time, Odell said. People park on this street. But given everything you just told me, he let that sit for a moment. Figured you ought to know. You remember anything about the plate's state? He thought for a moment. South Carolina, I believe. I can't say for certain, but that's my recollection. He held my gaze a moment longer, then nodded the nod of a man who has said what he came to say and is at peace with having said it. He went down the steps across the front path and along the sidewalk toward his house 4 doors down, carrying his empty cup and his quiet dignity, and leaving me with considerably more to think about than I had had before he arrived. I sat alone on the porch. The afternoon light had shifted. The sun was lower now, pulling long shadows from the oaks across the pale pavement. The biscuit plate still sat on the table between the chairs, crumbs and all, and I left it there. The coffee had gone cold. I thought about South Carolina plates. I thought about a man sitting in a car on this street twice for 20 minutes, watching a house. 2 or 3 weeks ago, which placed it squarely in the period when Brittany had already been in contact with the law firm in Columbia, when the machinery of whatever she had been building was already in motion. The connection might be nothing, or it might be the part of the picture I had not yet been able to place. My phone buzzed on the arm of the rocking chair. An unknown number, no contact name, Georgia area code, but not one I recognized. I looked at the screen through 2 full rings. Then I set the phone back down and let it finish. Whoever it was would call back if it mattered. And if it mattered, I would be ready. The evening had settled in by the time the notifications began. I was at the kitchen table with a bowl of soup I had managed to put together from what was left in the refrigerator, not much but enough. The house was quiet in the way it had been quiet all weekend, that particular stillness of a place where the usual rhythms have been interrupted and have not yet found their way back. I was halfway through the soup when the phone began moving on the table beside me. Not 1 notification, not 2. The device was practically vibrating itself across the surface, a steady, relentless arrival of alerts that had the quality of something organized rather than spontaneous. I picked it up. Brittany Sinclair had posted a video online approximately 40 minutes earlier. By the time I saw it, the post had already gathered several hundred interactions, shares, responses. People adding their voices to something they had encountered 30 seconds ago and already felt certain about. The thumbnail showed her face in close-up eyes, reddened at the edges, candlelight soft. Behind her, the particular composition of someone who understood how a camera works and what it responds to. I pressed play. She spoke directly into the lens, which was the right choice for what she was doing. It creates the impression of a private conversation conducted publicly and intimacy performed at scale. Her voice was unsteady in a way that sounded practiced without being obviously so. She talked about a controlling father-in-law who had never accepted her, who had resented Preston's happiness because it represented something outside his management, who had chosen the night before their wedding to make a scene in front of everyone they loved and cared about. She did not raise her voice. Quiet grief, she had learned somewhere, lands harder than anger. She did not mention the deposits. She did not mention the vendor contracts. She did not mention the email to a law firm in another state, or the charge on a credit card that was not hers, or the withdrawal attempt from a business account she had no standing to access. She told one side of a story that had at least two, and she told it to several thousand people before I had finished my soup. I watched it through once without stopping. Then I opened the screenshot function on my phone and began working through the post, methodically, the video itself, the caption, the share count, the comment thread as it continued to build. Kayla Forsyth had shared it within minutes of posting with a line of text above it that read, "This woman deserves so much better than this. Sending her all my love." The comments were what comments are when a crowd has been handed a clear narrative and a clear target. What kind of father does something like that? Classic controlling behavior. She's better off without that family. I'm so sorry, Brittany. You deserve the world. I read through them the way I read a building inspection report looking for the structural elements, not getting distracted by the surface. I saved each screenshot into a folder I labeled with the date and sent the folder to Theodore Garland's email with a single line for the record. I did not post anything in response. I did not type a comment and delete it. I did not ask anyone to speak on my behalf. In 31 years of running a business, I have occasionally had clients who were unhappy with work I had done, and a small number of those clients had chosen to express that unhappiness publicly. I had learned early that responding in kind almost never serves the man who has the stronger position. If the work was sound, the work would speak. If the record was clear, the record would hold. My record was clear. I set the phone down, finished the soup, and washed the bowl. When I came back to the table and picked the phone up again, the comment thread had grown considerably. I scrolled through the new additions without reading most of them, looking for anything that stood out from the general texture of the conversation. I almost missed it. It was not near the top where the most engaged comments had accumulated. It was further down in the section where comments arrive in real time and scroll past quickly. A small account, no profile image, the kind of profile that exists to say one thing and no more. The display name read R. Sinclair, 5 words in the comment field. Ask her about Charleston. I read it once, stopped, read it again. Then I pressed screenshot before I did anything else. The comment was gone inside of 5 minutes, not hidden by the platform's automated systems removed. Manually, deliberately by whoever had posted it, as if the person had realized within moments of sending it that they had said more than they intended. I sat with the screenshot for a long time. Sinclair was Brittany's family name, the name she had carried into her marriage with Preston, and into every room in my house over the past 18 months. It was also the name of her father, Clifton Sinclair, the man from Charleston who had called me on Saturday morning and spoken for exactly 2 minutes about reputation and mutual respect before I ended the call. R. Sinclair. Not Clifton, someone else in that family with the same last name and a different first initial. And whatever they knew about Charleston, they had known it was worth saying publicly, and then thought better of it within the space of 5 minutes. I looked at the screenshot for a long time. The 5 words sat there in plain text against the white background of the screen, matter of fact and enormous at the same time. Ask her about Charleston. I did not know what had happened in Charleston. I did not know Brittany's history. There did not know what a person might find if they started asking questions in that city. I knew only that someone with her last name had chosen this particular moment, when Brittany's post was gaining momentum and attention, to leave that sentence where the public could see it, and had then pulled it back before most people had the chance. That combination of impulse and retreat told me something. People who have nothing real to say don't leave comments and then remove them inside of 5 minutes. They either say it and stand by it, or they don't say it at all. The removal meant something had been risked, which meant something was there to risk. I looked at the missed call still sitting in my call log, the unknown number from the afternoon, the one I had let ring through on the porch. Still no follow-up message, still no name. I set the phone down on the kitchen table. Charleston. Not tonight. I needed to know more before I moved, and moving without knowing was how a man made mistakes he couldn't undo. The right information would come. It already seemed to be finding its way toward me. I just had to be patient enough to let it arrive. I had not planned to go that morning. I had woken before 6, made coffee stood at the kitchen window while the neighborhood came slowly back to light, and told myself I would spend the day on practical matters, following up with Theodore, reviewing the contractor schedule for the November project, doing the ordinary work of a man who still has a company to run, regardless of what is happening in his personal life. By 7 o'clock, I was standing at the iron gate of First Baptist Church of Savannah on Bull Street, with no clear memory of deciding to walk there. Margaret and I had married in this building on June 14th, 1987. It was a Saturday morning in early summer, the kind of day Savannah produces occasionally, as if to remind you of what it's capable of. Clear sky, the heat not yet arrived. The whole city smelling of honeysuckle and cut grass. Her father had walked her down the aisle in a suit he'd had since 1962. I had stood at the front of that nave for 20 minutes before she appeared at the back of it. And in those 20 minutes, I had been more aware of my own heartbeat than I had been at any point before or since. I had not come back alone since the morning we buried her. The gate was unlocked. The side door off the garden was open the way it always is on weekday mornings, for the congregation members who come in to sit quietly before the day begins. I went in that way through the small garden, where the boxwoods have grown thick and the stone path has settled unevenly over the decades, and into the cool dimness of the nave. The morning light through the stained glass came in slow and colored amber and deep blue, and a particular shade of rose that lands on the old pine pews in a way that has not changed since the windows were installed in 1923. I know this because I had done minor restoration work on the building's exterior trim in 2016 and had read more about its history than the job strictly required. I sat in a pew near the middle, not the front where Margaret and I had always sat on Sunday mornings, somewhere in the middle where a man can be present without making a declaration of it. I had been sitting there perhaps 10 minutes when I heard the vestry door open. Curtis Bowman had been the pastor of this congregation for 22 years. He was 66 years old, broad across the shoulders, with close-cropped white hair, and the particular unhurried quality of a man who has spent decades being present with people in their worst moments and has learned that the most useful thing he can offer is usually just his continued presence. He saw me in the pew and came down the side aisle without any indication of surprise, which was either his professional composure or a genuine lack of it. With Bowman, it was hard to tell, and I had always suspected that was deliberate. He sat down one pew ahead and turned to face me, arm resting on the back of the bench, the way he sits when he is not performing anything, just present. "Alex," he said. "Curtis." He waited. I told him the shape of it, not every detail, not the legal specifics, but the essential architecture, the rehearsal dinner, the cancellations, the documents Cornelius had found, the conversation with Theo, the wooden box I had finally opened after 2 years. He listened without interrupting, without shifting his expression toward judgment or sympathy in any way that felt managed. He just listened. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. The light through the windows had changed slightly as the sun continued its climb, the rose panel above the east transept brightening to something closer to gold, the shadows on the floor moving in the slow, imperceptible way that shadows move in old buildings. "When was the last time you did something entirely for yourself, Alex?" His voice was unhurried, conversational, as if he were asking about the weather. Not for the company, not for Preston, not to honor Margaret's memory, just for you. I opened my mouth and found nothing ready. It was not that the question caught me off guard exactly. It was that I had no answer. I sorted back through the past 2 years, then further through the years of Margaret's illness, through the years of building the company, through the accumulating decades of being a husband and a father and an employer and a contractor and a reliable presence in the lives of everyone who needed one. I could not locate with any specificity a moment where I had done something simply because I wanted to. "I'm not sure," I said, Bowman nodded, as if that was exactly what he had expected. That's worth sitting with. I asked him about forgiveness, whether a man was required to offer it, and what it looked like when he did. Forgiveness isn't accepting what they did, he said. It's not agreeing with it, and it's not pretending it didn't happen. It's deciding that they no longer get to occupy space in your mind that belongs to you. He paused. That's not something you do for them. It's something you do so you can get your house back. I looked at the window above the altar, a large panel depicting a father and a young man, the older figure's hand extended, the younger one turned slightly away. It had been in this building longer than either of us had been alive. "What about Preston?" I asked. Bowman was quiet for a longer stretch this time. He looked at the same window I was looking at. "As some lessons cost more than others to learn," he said finally. "You can love someone and still step back and let them pay the full price of theirs. Those two things aren't opposites." He turned back to me. "The door you leave open and the door you stand in are different doors, Alex." I sat with that. The morning light in the nave was warmer than I had expected when I walked in. Old buildings hold the night cool for a while, and then the sun finds its angles and the warmth comes through the glass and the stone begins to give it back. And there is a particular moment when the temperature shifts from cool to gentle, and it feels like something you hadn't realized you needed. I stayed for a while after Bowman excused himself to prepare for a morning meeting. I sat alone in the pew with the light coming in, and the building doing what old buildings do, holding the weight of everything that had happened inside it, and asking nothing in return. When I finally stood and walked back up the aisle and out through the garden, the October sun had cleared the roof lines and was full on the pavement of Bull Street. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then I took out my phone and looked at the call log. The unknown number from Sunday afternoon was still there, still unanswered. I had let it ring twice now without responding. Whatever patience I was practicing it had its limits. I pressed call back. If Reverend Bowman's words just hit home for you, type "ready" in the comments. I read every single one. Quick note, this is a fictional story, with dramatized elements for storytelling purposes. If this content isn't for you, feel free to step away. But if you're staying, what's coming next is the piece that ties everything together. The afternoon had turned cool by the time the knock came. Not the sharp insistence of Saturday morning, not the uncertain tap of a neighbor with biscuits. This was the knock of a man who had driven 2 hours from Charleston to say something he had been putting off for longer than that measured deliberate. The knock of someone who is committed to the action and is simply following it through. I opened the door. Clifton Sinclair stood on the front porch alone. He was dressed plainly dark slacks, a collared shirt, with no tie, a jacket that had been put on for the occasion rather than for appearance. He was 60 years old and looked in this moment like a man who had not slept well in several days. In his right hand he held a manila envelope thick-sealed. His eyes met mine briefly when I opened the door, and then moved to a point just past my shoulder, not evasive exactly, but carrying the particular weight of someone who has come to say something they are not certain they have the right to say. "Mr. Hargrove." His voice was steady, though the steadiness cost him something. "Thank you for returning my call. May I come in?" I stepped back and held the door. I brought him into the sitting room, off the front hall, not the study, not the kitchen table where I had been doing most of my thinking these past 4 days. The sitting room was Margaret's room, in the way that certain spaces belong to certain people, even after they are gone. She had chosen the furniture arranged so the bookshelves kept the low table by the window, clear for the cup of tea she made every evening. It was a room where I did not usually conduct business. I brought Clifton Sinclair into it because I wanted the conversation to happen somewhere that reminded me of what steadiness looked like. He sat across from me, without waiting for the pleasantries to run their course. That I respected. I tried to stop this wedding, Mr. Hargrove. He set the envelope on the low table between us, but did not let go of it yet. I told Brittany what I believed, that she was not in the right place, that Preston deserved honesty, that whatever she was working toward was going to end badly for people who did not deserve it. His jaw tightened slightly. She doesn't take counsel well. She never has. He was quiet for a moment. 4 years ago, he said, Brittany was living in Charleston. She had been there about 8 months working at a property management company, a legitimate job, as far as it went. She met a young man through that work. His mother was a widow, 71 years old, a woman named Eleanor Marsh, who had lived in the same house in the Ansonboro neighborhood her entire adult life. Her husband had passed 3 years prior and left her a settled estate not extravagant, but solid. The kind of situation that a certain kind of person knows how to read. I did not move. I listened. Brittany cultivated a relationship with the son over the course of about 5 months, long enough to become a regular presence in Mrs. Marsh's home, long enough to be introduced to the family's financial arrangements in a casual, organic way, the way these things happen, when someone is patient and knows what they're doing. He paused. She began working her name into documents, a property co-management agreement first, then an addendum on a storage facility Mrs. Marsh owned outright. Small things positioned carefully. The kind of additions that look like administrative convenience until someone looks closely. Who looked closely? I asked. Mrs. Marsh's attorney, a woman who had managed the estate for 11 years and knew every document in the file by memory. She flagged the discrepancies, contacted the family, and within 2 weeks we had a clear picture of what had been done and how. Clifton finally released the envelope and sat back. Mrs. Marsh's family chose not to pursue it through the courts. She was elderly, the process would have been difficult for her, and the documentation, though problematic, was not yet fully executed. Her attorney sent a formal letter. Brittany was removed from all property records. The son ended the relationship. He stopped. I confronted Brittany myself, he said. She was calm about it. That was the part that stayed with me, not defensive, not upset. Calm. She said she hadn't done anything that couldn't be undone and that Mrs. Marsh had more than enough and would never have missed it. His voice did not change when he said this, but his hands resting on his knees pressed slightly harder. That was 4 years ago? I told myself she had learned something from it. When she met Preston, I wanted to believe that was true. I wanted to believe a good man could. He stopped himself. I was wrong, and I have known I was wrong since before the invitations went out. He pushed the envelope across the table toward me. Everything I kept is in there, he said. The email exchanges from that period, text messages I preserved, a written statement from Mrs. Marsh's attorney provided voluntarily because she believed it might be needed one day. There are no court records, the matter never went to filing, but the documentation is thorough. I am an organized man, Mr. Hargrove, when the situation calls for it. I picked up the envelope and opened the flap. The first page was a printed email chain between Brittany and the son, casual in tone, the kind of messages that wouldn't raise alarm, read individually, but read as a sequence showed a clear and patient architecture. The second page was a scanned copy of the property co-management agreement with Brittany's signature in a place it had no business being. Same approach, different city, different name, different amount, but the same hand moving across the same kind of target with the same kind of patience. I set the papers back in the envelope and looked at Clifton Sinclair. He was 60 years old and sitting in a dead woman's sitting room, having just handed me evidence against his own daughter. And his eyes were the eyes of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally put it down in the right place. I stood up and extended my hand. It took a great deal to come here, Mr. Sinclair, I said. I mean that. He stood and took my hand. His grip was firm, the grip of a man who means the gesture. When I looked at him directly, his eyes were red at the edges, not from weakness, I thought, but from the particular exhaustion of doing something right after a long time of not doing it. He nodded, once collected his jacket from the arm of the chair, and I walked him to the door. When I came back inside, I stood in the front hall for a moment with the envelope in my hand. Then I took out my phone and called Theodore Garland. He answered on the first ring. Theo, I said, I'm on my way to you right now. You'll want to see what I have. A brief pause. Then I'll put the coffee on. Theo read the way he always reads, completely without skimming, without looking up. I had placed the manila envelope on the table between us when I arrived, and he had opened it. Immediately spread the contents in a careful arrangement across the surface of the desk, and begun at the first page. The desk lamp threw a clean, direct light across the documents. I sat across from him with a cup of coffee that had been warm when he handed it to me, and had since made its peace with the temperature of the room. I watched him work through it. There is something particular about watching a man you trust read something important. You track his face for signals without meaning to the small shifts of attention, the moments when he slows, the moments when he goes back to reread something he has already read. Theo's face gave very little away under most circumstances, which was one of the qualities that had made him effective in a courtroom for 30 years. But I knew the face well enough to notice when his reading slowed on the second page of the Charleston documents and again on the attorney's written statement, and I knew what that slowing meant. He was taking it seriously in the way that serious things deserve. When he finished, he squared the pages back into a neat stack and set them beside the original documents from the company files, the forged invoices, the email thread from Preston's account. He arranged them in a row across the desk side by side and sat back in his chair. He looked at me for a moment before he spoke. "Alex," he said. This was not impulsive. This was not a young woman who made poor choices under pressure or acted out of hurt feelings. He gestured at the row of documents. She operates from a template. Charleston was the rehearsal. You were the main event. I had suspected something close to that since the night I sat in the parking lot with the document spread across my truck's center console. Hearing it said plainly by a man who dealt in evidence for a living made it land differently, not heavier, but more settled. The way a thing becomes manageable when it has been named accurately. "Well, walk me through where we stand," I said. Theo picked up his pen and turned to the yellow legal pad he keeps on the left side of his desk, the one that has been a fixture of his working method since law school. "We have 3 forged signatures on vendor invoices sent through the company email system on days you were on site out of town. We have a documented email inquiry to an out-of-state law firm regarding LLC spousal ownership transfer, sent from an account created under your son's name, initiated 3 days after you committed to funding the wedding." He wrote as he spoke, not for my benefit, but for his own, the habit of a man who thinks more clearly when the words are in front of him on paper. "We have an unauthorized charge of $22,000 on your personal credit card for a reservation made in your name without your knowledge or consent. We have an attempted withdrawal of $14,200 from the company operating account, blocked fortunately, by a transaction threshold you set 2 years ago, with no particular awareness of how useful it would turn out to be." He paused, tapped the Charleston file. "And now we have documentation from a prior incident in another state, a different target, a different city, the same method. A written statement from an attorney who observed that incident directly and preserved her records against exactly this kind of future need." He set the pen down. "Taken individually, any one of these could be contested. Taken together, they describe a course of conduct, and a course of conduct is considerably harder to argue away than a single incident. The cease and desist," I said, "goes out tonight." He had already turned to a draft on the far side of the desk. I could see the letterhead from where I sat. "It goes to Brittany directly, not through Preston. It lays out the documented evidence and makes clear that any further contact with company accounts, company personnel, or your personal financial instruments will result in immediate escalation to law enforcement." He glanced up. "It is not a court order, Alex. I want you to understand that clearly. It is a formal warning that tells her we have the file and we are prepared to use it. What she does with that information will tell us something. And the police report, filed first thing tomorrow morning, Savannah PD forgery and unauthorized financial access." He folded his hands on the desk. "I want you to hear what I'm about to say carefully, because I have watched people expect the wrong things from this stage, and it has not served them well." I nodded. "The investigation will take time, weeks at minimum, more likely several months. The wheels of a criminal inquiry turn at their own pace, regardless of how clear the evidence appears to the people who assembled it. There will be periods of apparent inactivity. There will be procedural steps that feel slow. You will want things to move faster than they do." He held my gaze. "This is a marathon, Alex, not a sprint. The strength of what we have is not in its urgency, it is in its completeness. Let it work. And the Charleston file. I'll contact Mrs. Marsh's attorney this week. Her written statement indicates a willingness to cooperate. If the matter proceeded formally, we'll need to confirm that directly. and we'll need to understand what her documentation can contribute to a Georgia-based case. He made a note on the legal pad. It establishes pattern. Pattern is significant in how these cases are evaluated and prosecuted. It is worth the time to do it properly. I sat for a moment with all of it laid out in front of me. 63 years old, sitting in my attorney's office on a Monday night with a row of evidence across his desk that documented what had been attempted against everything I had spent my life building. 3 days ago, I had been standing in Whitfield Estate with a check in my vest pocket and a son I believed I knew. A great deal had changed in 3 days. But sitting across from Theodore Garland with the documents ordered and the plan in motion and the next steps clear, I was aware of something I had not felt at any point since Friday evening. The sensation of not being alone in it, of having the right person in the right chair with the right information doing what he did best. I had not realized until that moment how much of the previous 3 days I had carried by myself. "Thank you, Theo," I said. He made a small dismissive gesture, the one he uses when gratitude makes him uncomfortable, which it reliably does. "Go home, Alex. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow is going to require you." I left the office a little before midnight. Outside, Savannah had settled into the particular quiet of a Monday night. In October, the old streets empty the gas lamps, throwing their amber pools across the brick pavement. The live oaks overhead moving slightly in a wind that carried the faint salt of the river somewhere to the east. I had walked these streets in every season for more than 30 years. They looked the same as they always had. I got in my truck and drove home without turning on the radio. The phone sat in my jacket pocket untouched. Whatever was waiting in it could wait a few more hours. The documents were in the right hands. The next steps were in motion. For the first time since Friday night, I simply drove and breathed and let the quiet city go, past the windows, and did not ask anything more of myself than that. Tuesday morning arrived with a different kind of quiet. I was already at the kitchen table with my coffee when the phone began to move, not the relentless wave from Sunday night, but something steadier, more measured. One message, then a pause, then another. Familiar names on the screen. People I had known for years, some for the better part of my adult life. The tone of what they sent was unlike anything I had received since Friday. Not demands, not pressure. Some of them were apologies. Odell arrived before 8. I opened the door and poured him a cup without asking, and he sat down with the manner of a man who has something specific to report and intends to do it efficiently. "That fellow I mentioned," he said. "The one with the South Carolina plates." I waited. My neighbor 2 doors down recognized the car when I described it. Said she'd seen it parked on the street at least 4 times before the wedding, not just twice like I thought. She wrote down part of the plate because she was concerned about it. Her nephew confirmed the vehicle came out of a rental agency in Charleston. I set my cup down. Clifton Sinclair had told me he tried to stop the wedding. What he had not said, what I now understood, was that he had come to Savannah to do it in person and lost his nerve every time. He had sat in a rental car on East Jones Street 4 times over the course of a week, watching this house, deciding whether to walk up the front path and say what he knew. He had driven 2 hours each way 4 separate times and had not once made it to the door, not until after everything had already come apart. I folded the paper, Odell slid across the table and held it for a moment. "Thank you," I said. He finished his coffee and left without making more of it. That is the particular quality I have always valued in Odell Crutcher. He understands that information is just information, and that the man receiving it gets to decide what it means. By mid-morning, I had pieced together how the story had begun moving through the city. Cornelius had said nothing publicly. That was not his way. But 15 years in the same industry builds a particular kind of network. The people he worked alongside knew how to read a situation, and what they read was straightforward. The vendor contracts carried one name. The cancellation call had come from that same person, directly without confusion or ambiguity. The professional record was clean, and in a trade community, a clean record speaks. Nadine Buckley had confirmed to several colleagues in the event industry what she already knew, that Alexander Hargrove had been the sole contracting party on every document she held, that his signature was on every legitimate agreement, and that when he called to cancel, He had been calm, clear, and completely in his rights. She had stated facts. She had not editorialized. She had not needed to. Online, the comments beneath Brittany's post had begun to shift in tone. I checked once briefly and saw enough questions appearing among the earlier responses. People noting that the story they were hearing from other directions did not quite match the one in the video. By afternoon, Kayla Forsyth's share had disappeared. No explanation, no announcement. Simply gone the way things go when a person has reconsidered the ground they were standing on. I did not feel satisfaction about any of this. The truth finding its own level is not a victory. It is simply what happens when the record is accurate and enough people have access to it. Gloria called at 3 o'clock. I heard what the call cost her before she said the first word. Alex, a breath. Then, I didn't know. I need you to understand that I genuinely did not know. I know you didn't. I called you Saturday morning and pushed you to go back and fix it, and I never once asked why it happened. I just accepted what I'd been told and treated you like the problem. Her voice caught slightly. I'm sorry. I mean that completely. You were trying to hold things together, I said. That's what you've always done. I did it wrong. Yes, I said. I've done the same thing for longer than I want to admit. We're not so different in that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said it again plainly. I'm sorry, Alex. I hear you, I said, and I'm glad you called. We did not talk much longer. The important thing had been said in plain language, and adding to it would have only diluted it. I turned the desk lamp off at 9:30. The room went dark around me. I sat still for a moment before getting up, listening to the house settle, listening to the street outside, listening to the particular silence of a Tuesday night in October when the worst of something has passed, and what remains is simply the fact of it. Then the phone moved once on the desk. I picked it up. Preston's name on the screen, a text message, 2 words, I'm sorry. I looked at them for a long time, long enough for the screen to dim. I pressed the button and read them again. 2 words, no explanation attached, no negotiation embedded inside them, no ask. Just those 2 words sent at 9:30 on a Tuesday night by a man who had arrived at the far edge of something and found standing there that he had less to say than he thought he would. I set the phone face down on the desk. I did not reply. Not tonight. What he had sent deserved a real answer, and a real answer required more than I could honestly give in this moment. Sending something hollow because the hour felt right would have been a disservice to both of us. I left the phone on the desk in the dark, went upstairs, lay down, and for the first time since Friday night, sleep arrived without being summoned. The phone was still face down on the desk where I had left it. I saw it when I came downstairs Wednesday morning, sitting exactly where I had placed it the night before, screen dark, the message underneath it, unread by no one except me. I made coffee first. Then I stood at the kitchen window for a while, watching East Jones Street come into the morning at its own pace. The live oaks. The gas lamp on the corner still burning in the gray early light before the sun had cleared the rooftops. A man walking a dog on the far sidewalk unhurried the dog, investigating something in the base of a tree. Ordinary Wednesday. The city indifferent as cities are to whatever was about to happen inside this house. I stood at that window for the better part of an hour. Then I went to the desk, picked up the phone, and called my son. He answered before the second ring. Not with words, just the sound of the line opening, and then his breathing, and then a silence that told me he had been waiting for this, and was not sure what to do, now that it had arrived. Preston, I said. Dad. His voice was not what it had been on Saturday morning, not the rehearsed velocity of a man who had been building his argument in the car on the way over. This was something stripped down, tired in the way that people get tired when they have been carrying something they cannot put down and have finally stopped pretending it isn't heavy. He stopped, started again. I don't know how to. You don't have to explain right now, I said. I'm not calling for an explanation. A long pause on the line. Then why are you calling? I sat down in the chair by the window, the same chair I had sat in Saturday morning, when he stood in this room and said everything he had rehearsed. The morning light came in at a different angle today earlier, cooler the October sky, clear and pale. Because there are some things I need to say. I said, and I want to say them while I still can and while you're still in a place where you might be able to hear them. He said nothing. I took that as permission to continue. I have loved you in the way I know how to love Preston, which is to give, to build things for the people I care about, and call that love, because that's the language that came most naturally to me. I paused. What I understand now sitting here is that there is something I could never give you no matter how much I wanted to. And that is your own backbone. That's not a thing a father can hand over. It has to be built by the man who's going to need it. I heard him exhale long, unsteady. Before your mother passed, I said, she wrote letters. One of them was for you. I have been holding it in a wooden box in my desk drawer for 2 years because I did not know when the right time was to give it to you. I stopped for a moment. That was my failure, not hers. She knew what she wanted to say to you. I was the one who kept it waiting. You should have had that letter a long time ago. What does it say? His voice was quieter now. Not defensive, something younger than that. That's between you and her, I said. I'll get it to you. But I'll tell you this much, she was not writing to a man she had given up on. She was writing to a man she believed could do better than what she was worried he might settle for. The line was quiet for a long stretch. Outside, a car moved slowly past the window tires on the brick pavement, and then the street went still again. I know I let you down, Preston said finally. The words came out flat without decoration, the way words come when a person has finally stopped managing them. I know what I did, and I know what I didn't do, which was worse. Standing there and not saying anything. He stopped. I know, I said. I don't know how to fix it. You don't fix it, I said. You can't unwind what happened. What you can do is decide what kind of man you want to be, going forward, and then be that man consistently enough that it means something. That's all any of us can do. Another silence. Then I said, the last thing I had come to say, the thing I had been finding my way towards since Saturday morning, through every phone call and closed door and quiet hour in between. The door is not locked, Preston. I want you to understand that clearly, but I am not going to stand in it and hold it open waiting. When you are ready, genuinely ready, not ready to make things comfortable again, but ready to be the man your mother raised you to be, you know where I am. He did not respond immediately. I did not rush him. When he spoke, it was just 2 words said differently than the text message from the night before. Not sent into the dark, said directly over a live line where I could hear the weight of them. Yes, sir. I held the phone for a moment after we hung up. I did not cry. I had expected that I might, and I did not. What I felt was something more difficult to name than grief, and more durable than relief. The particular settling that happens when you have said the true thing in the right words, at the right, a moment, and it is done, and no amount of revisiting it will change or improve it. The conversation was complete. What came next was up to him. I set the phone on the desk and sat for a while in the quiet. Then I stood up, walked to the hallway, and took the truck keys from the hook on the wall, the iron hook I had mounted there myself the first winter we lived in this house, because Margaret said she was tired of looking for her keys on the kitchen counter every morning. I turned the keys over in my hand once. I knew exactly where I wanted to go. I had not been there in 6 years, not since the last time Margaret and I had made the drive together, the windows down, her hand resting on the doorframe, the way she liked to do when the weather was good. I opened the front door and stepped out into the Wednesday morning. I drove out before the sun came up. The road from Savannah to Tybee runs east through the salt marsh, 18 miles of 2-lane blacktop, flanked by cordgrass and open water. The sky above it enormous and pale in the hour before dawn. I had made this drive hundreds of times over the years, in every season, for every kind of reason. But I had not made it alone, not with intention, not like this in 6 years. The parking area near the north end of the beach was empty when I arrived. I left the truck and walked across the sand in the gray pre-dawn light, following a line I did not need to think about. My feet knew where they were going. The rock was where it had always been. A flat shelf of stone at the northern edge of the beach, set slightly back from the waterline, large enough for 2 people to sit comfortably with their feet toward the water. Margaret and I had found it on the morning after our wedding, in June of 1987. We had driven out early before anyone else was awake, and sat on this rock with coffee and paper cups, and watched the Atlantic come in, and she had leaned her head against my shoulder and said that this was a good beginning. We had come back to it across the years. Not always, not on any particular schedule, but enough times that it had become ours in the way that certain places become yours, not through ownership, but through return. I sat down on the rock. The ocean in the early morning had the particular color of old pewter, not blue, yet not gray exactly. Something in between that changes as the light builds. The waves came in at their own pace, indifferent to the calendar, indifferent to the fact that today was the Saturday that had been circled on a planning document somewhere for the better part of a year, the day that was supposed to be Preston's wedding day. I did not check my phone. I did not think about the Savannah PD investigation and how many weeks it had left to run. I did not think about the cease and desist letter that had been delivered, or the response Theodore was waiting on, or the call I would need to make to him early next week. I did not think about Brittany or the law firm in Columbia, or the file sitting in Theo's cabinet with Eleanor Marsh's attorney's signature on the cover page. All of that existed. All of it would require attention and time. But not on this rock on this morning. I sat and listened to the water. At some point I did not track when I began to think about 63 years. Not in a deliberate way, not reconstructing a timeline, but the way memory works when you stop trying to direct it and let it move on its own. A boy growing up in a house where money was something other people had, and you worked for what you needed, and you did not complain about the distance between the two. A young man with a truck and a license and a set of skills he had built by watching other people, who knew more than he did, and asking questions until they stopped being strangers. A woman who looked at that young man in the parking lot of a hardware store on a Thursday afternoon in 1985 and said something that made him laugh, and whom he could not stop thinking about afterward. 38 years of marriage, the building of something, a company, a home, a life that had more in it than he had any right to expect when he started. The years of plenty and the years of difficulty and the long middle stretch where the two were indistinguishable from each other, because that is what a life actually is, as opposed to what you imagine it will be when you are young enough to imagine it cleanly. The years at the end when the woman who had made all of it make sense was leaving in the slow way that is somehow harder than a sudden leaving, and he was there for all of it, and he did not look away. I had not been a perfect man in any of those years, not as a husband, not as a father, not as an employer, or a contractor, or a neighbor, or a friend. I had been too hard in some places and too yielding in others. I had given where I should have held back and held back where I should have given. I had confused building things with loving people often enough that it had cost me something I could not fully calculate. But I had not stopped trying. In 63 years, I had not once stopped trying. I reached into the pocket of my jacket. The check was still there, folded once along the center, the way I had placed it the night of the rehearsal dinner. $78,500, written in my handwriting, signed with my name. I had carried it through the worst 5 days of my adult life, without spending it, without losing it, without knowing quite what to do with it. I unfolded it and held it flat in both hands. The light had shifted while I was sitting. The pewter had given way to something warmer. The first real color of the morning, arriving at the horizon, the way Savannah mornings arrive, as all without announcement. The water had gone from gray to the faint green blue of early light on the Atlantic. I looked at the check for a long moment. Then I tore it in half, and then in half again and again, until what I was holding was a small collection of pieces that no longer resembled what they had been. I opened my hands and let the wind off the water take them. They scattered and fell and were gone, some into the sand, some toward the water line, some simply carried off in a direction I could not track. $78,500. Given, willingly lost, honestly released completely. I let it go. From somewhere in the quiet of my own memory, Margaret's words came back not the way I had read them off the page in the study last Saturday, but softer. The way her voice had sounded in this exact place on a June morning 38 years ago. The day you begin living for yourself, instead of building for everyone else, that is the day I can finally close my eyes in peace. I looked out at the Atlantic. "I think I'm ready, Margaret," I said. The words were quiet enough that only the water could have heard them. That was fine. The water had been here longer than either of us, and it knew how to keep things. The sun was fully above the horizon now. warm on my shoulders through the jacket. The kind of warmth that arrives unexpectedly on an October morning and reminds you that the season is not finished yet, that there is still time left, and that time used well becomes something. I stood up, brushed the sand from my jacket. I did not know what the road ahead looked like. Preston and I had a long way to go, or perhaps we did not. That was his to decide as much as mine. The legal process would take the time it needed. Hargrove Construction had 11 people who showed up every morning and did good work, and that would continue. The house on East Jones Street would be there when I got back. With its heart pine floors and the kitchen, Margaret had drawn on a legal pad and the back garden that was already turned and waiting for spring. And I, for the first time in longer than I could honestly say, was genuinely curious about what came next. Not anxious, not braced for impact, curious, willing, open to whatever the next chapter turned out to be. I walked back across the sand toward the parking area, the Atlantic behind me, the morning ahead. Looking back now, I see a man who confused giving everything with loving well. I built houses for strangers and wrote checks for my son and told myself that was enough. It wasn't. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait until someone has taken everything before you ask yourself what you actually value. That's the hardest lesson in this dad revenge story, and I wish it hadn't cost so much to learn. If I could say one thing to every father watching this, the most important thing you will ever construct cannot be framed, measured, or invoiced. It is the kind of man your son sees when he looks at you. Build that first. Build that every single day. I'm not a perfect man. I never was. But I believe, and this is where I have to trust in God's design, because some things are simply beyond what a man can engineer on his own, that the pain in this family story was not without purpose. It stripped away what was false and left what was real. This wasn't just a dad revenge story. It was a story about a man finally learning to receive instead of only give, about understanding that protecting your legacy means protecting yourself first. If you've stayed this far, thank you. This family story was never easy to tell. For everyone who saw themselves somewhere in this dad revenge journey, you are not alone, and it is not too late. Thank you for walking this road with me all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what would you have done in Alexander's position. I genuinely want to hear your perspective. If this story moved you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Quick note. While inspired by real human experiences and social themes, some elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this type of content isn't your preference, feel free to explore other videos that suit you better.